Hi, this is Terry McCarty, and you are listening to another episode of Reviews and Otherwise. And the topic for this episode is 70s Westerns, starting out with a brief Clint Eastwood discussion, and then proceeding to genre deconstruction, which a lot of directors engaged in the 1970s. So let's get started with Clint Eastwood. And if you haven't heard it, I would recommend the Lex G podcast, where he talks about Clint's career in detail from Fistful of Dollars, 64, up until the Rookie, which was around 1990. So, recommending that heartily. And out of respect, I try to keep my Clint discussion pretty brief, and just started out by mentioning 1970, Two Mules for Sister SARA, which he did with Shirley MacLaine, and was directed by Don Siegel, and then Bud Betticher was involved with it at some point in the development. And that had the Ennio Morricone score with the donkey sound effects you hear in the main title theme, and it's essentially Clint and Don making for Universal a Man with No Name picture that was probably a little more modified than something Leone would have made, and certainly people remember Shirley MacLaine giving Clint as good as he got as the traveling nun. And let's move on from there to 3 years later, High Plains Drifter, which was a Man with No Name, but Clint, directing himself, took out of the Leone context and put it into a more explicit allegory, and this was the hellish version, which he, a dozen years later, tried to, with Pale Rider, modify that a bit and make the character more avenging angel, and just to recommend High Plains Drifter, and also the more conventional John Sturgis Joe Kidd, which probably for its period, Joe Kidd is maybe a little bit woke because of the Clint's character finding some empathy for the man he's supposed to be tracking down. John Saxon playing Mexican character Louis Llama. And so probably for 1972, it's a little bit woke in terms of mainstream Westerns at that juncture, or especially mainstream Westerns coming out of a conventionally minded studio like Universal. So High Plains Drifter and Joe Kidd on the current Blu-rays, recommending, and I'm going to be trying to check them out myself because they now, each of them have commentary tracks by the famed director Alex Cox, who still his best-known films are in the 80s, Repo Man and Sid and Nancy. But Cox has been a astute historian of Westerns, and especially Italian Westerns, over the recent decades. And it would be, or I'm guessing will be, quite fascinating to watch those again with Mr. Cox's learned commentary. So now that leaves just two films to discuss. The Beguiled, spring 1971, I believe, is when it came out. And as Don Siegel said, it's the best film I ever made and the best film Clint ever made. And it's not strictly Western since it takes place during the Civil War, but it's something that, especially for its period, it's pretty unapologetic about throwing stones at toxic masculinity and misogyny. And to Clint's credit, he goes there, he takes up residence, he's spectacularly evil toward the end of the film, and I'm sure that the audiences of the time that didn't reject it for not being typical Clint probably enjoyed the aspect of Pamela Furton, who was the ubiquitous in her childhood and into her teens, ubiquitous actress, and probably appreciated the fact that she's a key instrument in the Eastwood character's ultimate destruction. Now on to 1976 and the Outlaw Josie Wales, which was started by Philip Kaufman, and Clint fired him, took over direction. And if you want Clint's version of the drop kicking of Philip Kaufman, then go to Richard Schickel's Eastwood bio, which is very, very sycophantic and pretty much, anything Clint said to Schickel is wonderful and not to be, dismissed or whatever. And sidebar, Patrick McGilligsn did do a bio about Eastwood, and in its original form, it was pretty pointed at the gap between the image that Clint's crafted and the actual person behind the image. And if memory is correct, there had to be some edits before it was published in the U.S. But back to Outlaw Josie Wales, it was the first conscious courting that Clint did of mainstream critics, and probably the best thing to happen to Clint in terms of approval and people taking a look at the film that wouldn't bother with a Clint Eastwood film otherwise was when Orson Welles came out and praised it. And even some mainstream critics of the period, like Marie Brenner, who for a time did a column for Texas Monthly, and it was basically like I guess you could say somewhere but on the scale between Pauline Kael and Renata Adler at scorn for mainstream movie making in the 70s. But Marie Brenner, although she's saying the Josie Wales as being overlong and occasionally simple-minded, she at least recognized the overall quality of the film, and of course that was another step towards Clint later becoming more of a conscious artiste, but post Josie Wales there wasn't really any attempt to reach for art. I believe, like Roger Ebert, who was always on board with Clint, kind of made more of the gauntlet than it is, and I don't think anybody has ever looked at Every Which Way But Loose and tried to make a case for that as a neglected masterpiece. So it wasn't till early 80s, Bronco Billy, Honky Tonk Man, and then you could say from Pale Rider more or less onward, that's when Clint went back to building a support system of media and changing or making sure that negative perceptions of him were changed. So that's all for Mr. Eastwood, and I'll be right back in just a little bit. Hi, this is Terry McCarty, and you are listening to another episode of Reviews and Otherwise. And the topic for this episode is 7